The early morning sun cast long shadows across the plains as Samuel Wilson adjusted the leather satchel slung over his shoulder, his polished geological tools catching glints of light. Having graduated from Yale just months prior, the young scientist felt distinctly out of place among the weathered faces at the Abilene station. His crisp Eastern attire and clean-shaven face marked him immediately as an outsider, drawing suspicious glances from the locals gathered on the wooden platform. The letter from the Davis Mining Company had promised him the opportunity of a lifetime, surveying unexplored territories in the Colorado Territory for precious metals. But Samuel harbored a different theory, one that had earned him ridicule back east. He believed the real wealth lay not in gold or silver, but in the dark pools of oil he suspected lay beneath these vast grasslands. Thomas Johnson, the local cattle baron, watched the newcomer from the shadows of his office above the general store. His weathered hands clenched into fists as he recognized the surveying equipment. Another mining prospector meant more trouble for his carefully controlled empire. The vast Johnson ranch stretched for miles in every direction, its boundaries marked by the blood of those who had challenged his authority. Catherine Miller wiped the sweat from her brow as she loaded supplies into her father's wagon. At 22, she had already earned a reputation as one of the shrewdest cattle traders in the territory. Her father James Miller's illness had forced her to take charge of their modest ranch, and she doubled their herd through careful breeding and shrewd deals. But Thomas Johnson's growing influence threatened everything they'd built. The town of Abilene itself seemed to hold its breath that morning, as if sensing the change this eastern newcomer would bring. Dust devils danced down the main street, past the saloon where William Thompson, the town's corrupt sheriff, nursed his morning whiskey. The alliance between Thompson and Johnson had kept the peace, their kind of peace, for years. Samuel made his way to the Miller Ranch on the outskirts of town, where he'd arranged to rent a room. The modest two-story house stood in stark contrast to the sprawling Johnson mansion visible on the distant hills. Catherine watched him approach, noting his precise movements and the intelligent gleam in his eyes. This was no ordinary prospector. That evening, as Samuel unpacked his equipment, he caught snippets of conversation between Catherine and her father. The Millers were losing cattle mysteriously. Their best grazing lands suddenly declared off-limits by Sheriff Thompson. The pattern was clear. Johnson was slowly choking out the smaller ranchers, absorbing their lands one piece at a time. The next morning, Samuel began his surveys, carefully marking locations on his maps. He'd chosen the Miller Ranch as his base, not just for its convenient location, but because geological formations he'd studied suggested oil deposits might lie beneath their struggling pastures. If he was right, it could change everything, not just for the Millers but for the entire territory. James Miller watched the young geologist with growing interest. Though weakened by his illness, the old rancher's mind remained sharp. He recognized something in Samuel that reminded him of himself in younger days. Not just intelligence, but a quiet determination. That evening, he shared stories of the territory's history, painting a picture of how Johnson had risen to power. As Samuel lay in bed that night, his mind raced with possibilities. The rock formations he'd observed matched his theories perfectly. But more than that, he was beginning to understand the human element at play. This wasn't just about finding oil. It was about breaking the grip of men who controlled these lands through fear and manipulation. The real challenge would be surviving long enough to prove his theories correct. The following days established a pattern. Samuel would leave early, taking careful measurements and samples, while Catherine managed the ranch's daily operations. They found themselves sharing quiet conversations during meals, her practical knowledge of the land complementing his scientific understanding. But dark forces were already moving against them. Thomas Johnson's men began following Samuel's movements, reporting back on his activities. The cattle baron had built his empire on controlling not just the land, but information itself. When foreign investors had previously shown interest in the territory, Johnson had ensured they saw only what he wanted them to see. This educated Easterner threatened to upset that careful balance. Sheriff Thompson increased his harassment of the Miller Ranch, finding new regulations to enforce and fees to collect. But Catherine proved as stubborn as her father, meeting each challenge with calculated resistance. She recognized that Samuel's presence offered a chance to break Johnson's stranglehold on the territory, even if she didn't yet understand exactly how. Word spread quickly through Abilene about the strange work Samuel was doing. Some dismissed him as another crazy prospector, but others noted how methodically he worked, how different his approach was from the usual gold seekers. Johnson's saloon was filled with whispered conversations and speculation about what the Easterner might really be searching for. The tension built steadily over those first weeks, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Samuel knew he was getting close to proving his theories about the oil deposits. But, as he assembled his evidence, he also assembled a picture of the corruption that had taken root in this territory. The question was whether he could find the oil before Johnson found a way to stop him permanently. As Samuel crouched beside a rocky outcropping, carefully examining soil samples in the fading light, he heard the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approaching. His hand instinctively moved to the worn geological hammer at his belt. Not much of a weapon, but it was all he had. Through the golden haze of sunset, he recognized Thomas, one of Catherine's most trusted ranch hands, riding hard toward him. "Mr. Samuel, you need to come quick," Thomas called out, reining his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. "Johnson's men are at the north pasture. They're claiming water rights and threatening to dam up the creek that feeds Catherine's grazing land. She sent me to fetch you, says you might have some of that fancy Eastern law knowledge that could help." Samuel quickly packed his samples and field notes into his saddlebags, mounting his horse with less awkwardness than when he'd first arrived from Boston 3 months ago. The situation was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. Johnson wasn't just trying to stop his oil exploration anymore. He was attacking Catherine's ranch directly. They rode hard across the open plains, the wind carrying the sweet scent of prairie grass and distant rain. Samuel's mind raced through the territorial water rights laws he'd studied. Johnson's latest move was clever. Without water access, Catherine's cattle operation would slowly wither, forcing her to sell. And Samuel knew exactly who would be waiting to buy. At the north pasture, they found Catherine facing down James Johnson and 3 of his men. The cattle baron sat astride his black stallion, his silver-trimmed vest gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. 2 of his men were already unloading wooden stakes and survey equipment from their pack horses, acting as if the outcome was already decided. "Miss Catherine," Johnson was saying as Samuel and Thomas rode up, "these water rights were registered with the territorial office in Fort Worth last week. I have the papers right here." He patted his breast pocket with exaggerated care. "Now, I'm willing to be reasonable about access fees." Samuel dismounted and stepped forward, positioning himself beside Catherine. "Those rights weren't yours to register, Mr. Johnson. This waterway has been established as common access since the first ranches were settled here. I've seen the original territorial surveys in the Abilene courthouse." Johnson's practiced smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Well, if it isn't our Eastern friend, I wasn't aware you'd added water law to your geological interests. Though I suppose a man needs something to fall back on when his wild theories about oil don't pan out." Catherine's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. "My father and yours signed an agreement about these water rights 30 years ago, James? Or did you conveniently lose that document along with the others that disappeared after you took over the territorial office?" The setting sun cast long shadows across the pasture as the confrontation continued. Samuel noticed movement in the distance, more riders approaching from the direction of Abilene. He recognized William, Catherine's younger brother, leading several ranch hands their way. The odds were evening up. Johnson noticed too. His smile tightened as he assessed the changing situation. "Well, perhaps we can continue this discussion another time, when you've had a chance to review the new documentation." He turned his horse, gesturing to his men. "Pack it up, boys. We'll settle this properly, through legal channels." As Johnson and his men rode away, Samuel shared a knowing look with Catherine. They both understood that legal channels meant whatever Johnson could arrange with his corrupt officials. But Samuel had seen something in the soil samples he'd collected that afternoon. Something that could change everything. He just needed a little more time to prove it. William rode up as the dust from Johnson's departure settled. "Catherine, Samuel, I brought help as soon as I heard. But this isn't over, is it?" He looked worried, and with good reason. Their father had died under mysterious circumstances just days after opposing Johnson's last land grab. "No," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the concern in her eyes. "This was just the opening move. Johnson's planning something bigger." "Samuel, how close are you to confirming what you suspected about the oil?" Samuel pulled out his field notebook, flipping to his latest observations. "Very close. But Johnson knows it too. That's why he's pushing now. If we can prove there's oil here before he manages to seize control of the land..." He left the implications unspoken. They all understood the stakes. The autumn wind whipped across the open plains as Samuel Miller guided his horse along the fence line of the Wilson Ranch. His geological equipment rattled in the saddlebags, instruments that seemed alien to the rough cattle country of Colorado Territory. 3 months had passed since he'd left his comfortable position at Yale to pursue his theories about oil deposits in the West. But the hostility from local ranchers made those ivory tower days feel like a distant dream. Thomas Wilson's sprawling ranch dominated the valley north of Silver City, his cattle empire built on controlling not just the grass, but the water rights for miles around. Samuel had tried explaining his presence to the rancher, showing his credentials and surveys, but Wilson had dismissed him as another Eastern tenderfoot looking to upset the natural order. "We run cattle here, boy," Wilson had drawled. "Nothing else." But Samuel's scientific training told a different story. The geological formations, the seepage patterns, the distinct odor rising from certain creek beds, all pointed to vast oil deposits beneath the grazing land. He'd sent samples back east that confirmed his suspicions. Now foreign investors were sniffing around, led by the ruthless James Thompson of the British Petroleum Syndicate, who'd already tried buying Samuel's surveys. Catherine Davis watched the young geologist from the window of her father's general store in Silver City. Unlike the other townspeople who viewed Samuel with suspicion, she saw the quiet determination in his eyes. As the daughter of the town's most prominent merchant, Jake Davis, she understood the delicate balance of power that Samuel threatened to upend. Her father had warned her to stay away from the troublemaker, but something about his gentle manner drew her in. The situation grew more tense when William Johnson, Wilson's foreman, began shadowing Samuel's movements across the range. Johnson was a hard man who'd driven off other threats to his employer's interests, sometimes with violence. He'd already warned Samuel that accidents happened to those who didn't mind their own business. But Samuel refused to be intimidated, methodically documenting his findings while trying to avoid confrontation. Samuel found an unlikely ally in Elizabeth Miller, no relation despite the shared surname. The widow ran a small ranch on the valley's eastern edge, struggling to hold on to her land against Wilson's expansionist pressure. She offered Samuel a place to stay after the Silver City Hotel mysteriously lost his reservation. "This valley needs to change," she told him one evening. "The cattle barons can't rule forever." The first real trouble came during the autumn cattle drive. Wilson's men were moving 1,000 head north to the railhead at Abilene when Samuel discovered a major oil seepage along their traditional route. Word spread quickly, bringing a flood of prospectors and speculators. Wilson blamed Samuel for the chaos as his cattle drive ground to a halt, hemmed in by claim stakes and eager fortune seekers. Catherine secretly brought Samuel copies of land records from her father's office, revealing how Wilson had manipulated property boundaries over the years. The documents showed a pattern of fraud, but proving it would be dangerous. Jake Davis discovered their meetings and threatened to have Samuel arrested for theft, forcing Catherine to choose between family loyalty and what she knew was right. James Thompson arrived in Silver City with a team of lawyers and a private security force, setting up offices in the town's finest building. His men began approaching local landowners with contracts, offering quick cash for mineral rights. Thompson invited Samuel to join his operation, promising wealth beyond imagination. "You're a man of science," Thompson said smoothly. "Leave the messy business to us." But Samuel had seen how Thompson's company operated in Pennsylvania, leaving communities poisoned and broken. He began organizing small ranchers and farmers, showing them how to protect their rights. Elizabeth Miller hosted meetings at her ranch, despite increasing pressure from Wilson's men. The cattle baron responded by cutting off access to water sources, claiming breach of grazing agreements. William Johnson and his cowboys started stampeding their herds through camps of would-be prospectors, destroying equipment and driving them off. Samuel documented the attacks, but the local sheriff was firmly in Wilson's pocket. When Elizabeth's ranch house mysteriously burned one night, Samuel knew the violence would only escalate. He found her standing in the ashes at dawn, steel in her eyes. "They think they can scare us away," she said. "They don't understand what we're fighting for." Catherine's father caught her copying more documents and locked her in her room, but she managed to smuggle out evidence of conspiracy between Wilson, Thompson, and corrupt territorial officials. Samuel now had proof of illegal land grabs stretching back decades, but getting it to federal authorities meant crossing 100 miles of hostile territory. Every trail would be watched. The situation reached a breaking point when Wilson announced a massive cattle drive, larger than any before. He claimed grazing rights across the entire valley, threatening to run his herds through any land with survey stakes or oil equipment. It was a show of force meant to remind everyone who really controlled the territory. Samuel knew the drive would destroy months of careful work and possibly kill people in the process. Elizabeth Miller rallied other small ranchers to her cause, while Catherine convinced some of the town's merchants that their futures lay with progress, not Wilson's outdated empire. Samuel found himself at the center of a gathering storm. His scientific quest transformed into something far larger. The valley's future hung in balance as cattle drivers and oil seekers faced off across the autumn plains. As autumn winds swept across the valley, Samuel worked through the night in his makeshift laboratory, analyzing soil samples and documenting evidence. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows across carefully drawn maps, showing the vast oil deposits beneath Wilson's grazing claims. His geological training told him this discovery could transform the entire region, but first they had to survive the coming confrontation. Elizabeth Miller's coalition of small ranchers gathered at her homestead, their wagons forming a protective circle as they planned their response to Wilson's threatened cattle drive. Catherine moved among them, her quick mind and sharp business sense helping forge alliances between formerly competing families. The merchants she'd convinced to support them quietly stockpiled supplies, preparing for what everyone knew would be a long struggle. Word reached them that Wilson had hired additional men from as far as Fort Worth, hardened cowboys with reputations for violence. They began arriving in groups of 2 and 3, filling the saloons and making their presence known through late-night accidents that left survey equipment damaged and warning messages carved into fence posts. Samuel cataloged each incident, building evidence of intimidation while trying to keep his own workers from retaliating. The autumn air grew colder as tension mounted. Elizabeth's ranchers positioned riders along their boundaries, watching for the first sign of Wilson's massive herd. Samuel split his time between protecting his equipment and making secret trips to Silver City, where he'd found a sympathetic telegraph operator willing to send coded messages to his eastern investors. If they could hold out long enough, mechanical drilling equipment would arrive to prove the oil's value beyond any doubt. Catherine's network of allies among the merchants began to fracture under pressure. Wilson's men made it clear that anyone supporting the oil seekers would find themselves cut off from the cattle trade that had sustained the region for decades. Some shopkeepers withdrew their support, while others doubled down, seeing the potential wealth that oil development could bring. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which future would prevail. One frost-touched morning, Samuel found Elizabeth waiting at his work site, her face grave. "Wilson's men are blocking the high passes," she reported. "No equipment will make it through before winter." Behind her, the sun rose over distant peaks already dusted with early snow. They both knew that once winter settled in, Wilson's cattle would have destroyed any hope of proving the oil claim. Samuel spent hours studying maps, looking for alternative routes. The old mining trails through the mountains might work, but they'd been abandoned for years. Catherine suggested reaching out to Native American guides who knew hidden paths, but Wilson's influence ran deep there too. Every option seemed blocked, until Elizabeth mentioned her grandfather's stories about forgotten Spanish trade routes that had once connected Silver City to settlements further north. Working in secret, they pieced together fragments of the old trail system. Catherine used her connections with elderly Mexican families in the area, gathering oral histories passed down through generations. Slowly, a possible route emerged. Dangerous and difficult, but unguarded because Wilson's men didn't know it existed. Samuel knew bringing heavy equipment through such terrain was risky, but they were running out of options. The situation grew more complex when a mysterious Englishman arrived in town, claiming to represent European investors interested in both cattle and oil rights. He met with Wilson first, then approached Samuel with veiled offers of partnership. Catherine's instincts warned them that accepting foreign capital might solve their immediate problems, but create worse ones in the future. The valley's resources needed to benefit its people, not distant shareholders. As the first snow flurries danced across the plains, Samuel realized they were fighting not just for oil rights, but for the soul of the American West itself. The old order of cattle barons and their absolute control was facing its final challenge. Progress would come, but the question was whether it would arrive as a tool of liberation or just another form of exploitation. With winter approaching and Wilson's cattle drive looming, they had precious little time to find the answer. The spring cattle drive had barely begun when Samuel Wilson spotted the dark plumes of smoke rising from the direction of his oil discovery. His heart sank as he guided his horse away from the Thompson family's cattle herd. Knowing the foreign investors from Standard Oil would be arriving in Abilene within days, the timing couldn't have been worse. Someone had clearly set fire to his equipment, and he had a good idea who was behind it. James Thompson rode up alongside him, his weathered face creased with concern. "Those cattle barons ain't gonna let you develop that oil field without a fight, Sam. William Davis has too much power in these parts, and he aims to keep it that way." The old rancher had become Samuel's unlikely ally after the geologist helped save his herd from a devastating drought by locating underground water sources. The unlikely partnership between the Eastern-educated geologist and the Thompson family had raised eyebrows throughout the territory. But James Thompson recognized that the future lay in more than just cattle, and he'd agreed to let Samuel explore for oil on his vast grasslands in exchange for a share of any discoveries. Now that decision had put both men in the crosshairs of William Davis and his powerful associates. Catherine Thompson, James's daughter, appeared on her paint horse, her face flushed with anger. "Pa, Jake Miller's men are cutting across our north pasture with their herd. They're trying to scatter our cattle before we can get them to market." She'd inherited her father's keen eye for the cattle business, but lately her attention had been drawn to Samuel's scientific pursuits, much to the local cowboys' dismay. The situation was reaching a breaking point. Samuel had discovered the oil seep 3 months ago, and word had spread quickly despite his attempts at discretion. Now, with the Standard Oil representatives due to arrive and William Davis determined to maintain his iron grip on the region's economy, violence seemed inevitable. The cattle drive to Abilene had become about more than just delivering livestock. It was about survival. Mary Davis, William's wife, had secretly visited Samuel the previous evening, warning him that her husband planned to ensure the oil field would never see development. "He's afraid," she'd whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Afraid that oil will bring too many changes, too many outsiders. He'll do anything to stop it." Her words haunted Samuel as he watched the smoke rise higher into the cloudless sky. James Thompson gathered his most trusted hands, including his foreman Thomas Johnson, to devise a strategy. They needed to protect both the cattle and the oil field while maintaining their schedule to reach Abilene. The market wouldn't wait, and the foreign investors wouldn't either. Samuel found himself caught between two worlds, the ancient tradition of the cattle drive and the modern promise of industrial progress. Elizabeth Miller, Jake's sister and the local schoolteacher, had been helping Samuel document his geological findings. She understood the significance of his discovery, how it could transform the region from a cattle-dependent economy into something more sustainable. But her brother's loyalty to William Davis had placed her in an impossible position, torn between family ties and her belief in progress. The cattle drive moved forward under a tense cloud of anticipation. Samuel knew that William Davis wouldn't be content with merely burning equipment. The man had built his empire through intimidation and violence, and he wouldn't surrender his influence without a fight. The vast plains that had once seemed so open now felt like a chessboard, with each player maneuvering for advantage. Sarah Wilson, Samuel's sister, who had followed him west against their parents' wishes, arrived with urgent news from town. "The banker's been pressuring the merchants to refuse you supplies," she reported. "Davis is trying to strangle your operation before it can begin. But I've made contact with some sympathetic folks in Silver City who might be willing to help." The cattle drive became a cover for their real mission, protecting the oil discovery until the investors could arrive and provide the financial backing needed to stand against Davis. James Thompson's cowboys took turns guarding both the herd and the oil field, while Samuel worked frantically to salvage what equipment he could and document everything for the Standard Oil representatives. Emma Johnson, Thomas's wife and the owner of Abilene's General Store, began quietly stockpiling supplies they'd need for the confrontation everyone knew was coming. She'd seen too many good people driven out by William Davis's machinations, and she was determined this time would be different. The town was quietly taking sides, with battle lines being drawn between tradition and progress. As they moved the herd across the vast grasslands, Samuel caught glimpses of riders watching from distant ridgelines. Davis's men were everywhere, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The cattle drive had become a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with 3,000 head of cattle as both cover and liability. One stampede could destroy everything they'd worked for. The tension finally broke 3 days from Abilene. Jake Miller's men drove their herd directly into Thompson's cattle, causing chaos in the darkness before dawn. As cowboys scrambled to prevent a stampede, armed riders approached the oil field with torches. Samuel found himself racing back through the night, knowing that everything he'd discovered was at risk. What followed was a night of violence and revelation that would change the territory forever. William Davis himself appeared, but not as the villain they'd expected. He arrived with proof that foreign investors planned to steal the land from everyone, using Samuel's discovery as leverage. The real threat wasn't tradition versus progress, but rather local independence versus distant control. The revelation from William Davis changed everything in an instant. Samuel watched as the cattle baron pulled weathered documents from his saddlebag, spreading them across a makeshift table in the flickering lamplight. Maps marked with foreign investors' claims crisscrossed the territory like a spider's web, each intersection representing another piece of land they planned to seize. The moonlight cast long shadows across the faces of former enemies, now united by a common threat. Sarah, who had been managing the books for the oil operation, recognized several of the foreign names from mysterious inquiries that had crossed her desk. Her hands trembled as she traced the intricate network of planned acquisitions that would have stripped the land from both ranchers and wildcatters alike. The cattle drive had been merely a distraction, keeping everyone's attention focused on the wrong threat. As dawn broke over the plains, Samuel and William organized their combined forces. Cowboys who had been ready to shoot each other hours before now worked side by side, moving cattle away from the oil field while others fortified defensive positions. The foreign investors' hired guns would arrive soon, expecting to find a weakened and divided community ripe for the taking. Thomas, the old ranch hand who had initially distrusted Samuel's eastern ways, proved invaluable in coordinating the defense. His decades of experience reading the land helped them identify the most likely approaches their enemies would take. They used the natural contours of the prairie to their advantage, positioning lookouts where they could see for miles across the sun-bleached grass. The waiting was the hardest part. Elizabeth, the local schoolteacher who had become Samuel's confidant, helped maintain morale by organizing the town's women to provide food and medical supplies. The community that had been torn apart by progress now found itself bound together by necessity, their differences forgotten in the face of a greater danger. James, William's youngest son who had always dreamed of more than ranching, worked alongside Samuel to protect the oil derricks. The young man's engineering mind quickly grasped the potential of this new resource, and he saw in it a future where cattle and oil could coexist, enriching the territory instead of dividing it. His father watched with quiet pride as James stepped into his own kind of leadership. The attack came at noon, when the sun was highest and the shadows shortest. The foreign investors had hired a small army of mercenaries, expecting to find chaos, and instead meeting organized resistance. The battle for the oil field became a testament to the strength of a united community. Cowboys and townspeople fought shoulder to shoulder, their knowledge of the land proving superior to their enemies' numbers. Samuel found himself in the thick of the fight, defending not just his discovery but the future of the territory itself. The geological knowledge that had led him to the oil now helped him understand which areas would hold under heavy horse traffic and which would turn treacherous under stress. This information became a tactical advantage as the defenders channeled their attackers into natural traps. Mary, the widow who ran the local boarding house, proved herself a crack shot from her second-story window, protecting the town's flank while the men focused on the oil field. Her courage inspired others, and soon the windows of every building bristled with determined defenders. The foreign mercenaries found themselves caught in a crossfire they hadn't anticipated. The turning point came when Catherine, who had been monitoring telegraph communications, intercepted messages revealing the investors' true plans. They had similar schemes throughout the territory, but this was meant to be their first victory. The evidence she gathered would later prove crucial in legal battles, but in the moment, it helped the defenders understand the full scope of what they were fighting for. As the sun began to set, the attackers finally broke. Their retreat was chaotic, leaving behind weapons and wounded. The defenders, despite their victory, immediately began caring for the injured on both sides, displaying the humanity that their enemies had underestimated. This act of mercy would later become as legendary as the battle itself. In the aftermath, Samuel stood with William and Jake, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The oil derricks cast long shadows across the land, no longer symbols of division but of opportunity. The cattle still grazed nearby, proof that the old and new could coexist. The territory had changed, but its spirit remained unbroken, stronger now for having faced this challenge together. The sun cast long shadows across the plains surrounding Fort Worth as Jake Miller watched his carefully laid plans finally come to fruition. The Thompson cattle baron's hired guns had played right into his hands, attempting to sabotage his oil drilling operation by stampeding a massive herd through the site. But Jake had anticipated this move, having studied geology long enough to know that the real treasure lay deeper than any cattle hooves could disturb. William Davis, Jake's most trusted partner and fellow geologist, had positioned their workers strategically around the perimeter with torches and rifles. As the thundering herd approached through the gathering dusk, they created a carefully coordinated wall of light and sound that smoothly diverted the cattle around the drilling equipment. The Thompson men could only watch in frustration as their destructive plan dissolved into nothing more than a dramatic display of dust and bellowing. "Your old tricks won't work anymore, Samuel Thompson," Jake called out to the cattle baron who sat mounted on his horse at a distance, face twisted in barely contained rage. "This isn't about your grazing lands anymore. The world is changing, and oil is the future." Jake's words carried across the cooling evening air, heavy with the weight of inevitability. He had spent months building alliances with the railroad men and Eastern investors, knowing that progress couldn't be stopped by force alone. Sarah Wilson, the local banker's daughter who had initially doubted Jake's wild theories about oil deposits, now stood proudly beside him. She had risked her family's reputation and her own inheritance to help finance his operation when no one else would listen. Her father Thomas had nearly disowned her, but her faith in Jake's vision never wavered. The sight of the first oil spurting from the ground had vindicated them both. The failed cattle stampede marked a turning point in the power struggle that had gripped Fort Worth for months. James Thompson, Samuel's younger brother and secret ally to Jake's cause, finally stepped forward from the shadows. He had been feeding Jake information about his brother's schemes while working to convince other ranchers that adaptation, not resistance, was the path to prosperity. The look of betrayal on Samuel's face when he saw James cross the field to stand with Jake was worth more than any oil strike. Catherine Miller, Jake's sister, who had followed him west from Boston despite their parents' objections, emerged from the drilling office with a stack of papers. The contracts she had meticulously prepared would ensure that the local landowners received fair compensation for oil rights, breaking Samuel Thompson's monopoly on the region's wealth. Her legal training had proven as valuable as Jake's geological expertise. The evening wore on as more riders arrived, drawn by the news of the confrontation. Elizabeth Davis, William's wife, and the town's schoolteacher brought word that the railroad company's representatives were already on their way from Abilene. She had been instrumental in educating the townspeople about the benefits the oil industry would bring. Not just wealth, but schools, hospitals, and a future for their children beyond the uncertain fortunes of cattle ranching. Samuel Thompson made one final desperate attempt to maintain control, producing documents that supposedly proved his ownership of the mineral rights. But Mary Johnson, the elderly widow who had been the county clerk for 3 decades, stepped forward with records showing how Thompson had falsified land deeds years ago. The truth, like the oil itself, had finally risen to the surface. As the stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Jake reflected on how different this victory felt from what he had imagined when he first arrived from the East. He had come seeking scientific validation, hoping to prove his theories about petroleum deposits in the Western territories. Instead, he had found something far more valuable: a community ready to embrace change, partners willing to risk everything for progress, and a love that had grown as naturally as wildflowers after spring rain. The transformation of Fort Worth began in earnest the next day. The Thompson cattle empire crumbled not with violence but with signatures and handshakes. James Thompson's decision to convert much of his inherited ranch land into oil fields inspired others to follow suit. The cattle drives that had once defined the region gradually gave way to derricks and pipelines, though Jake ensured that enough grazing land was preserved to maintain the area's ranching heritage. Sarah's faith in Jake was rewarded beyond even her optimistic expectations. The oil wealth flowing into Fort Worth brought opportunities for everyone, not just the powerful few. Catherine established a legal practice specializing in mineral rights, helping ensure that small landowners weren't exploited. Elizabeth's school grew into a proper academy, with courses in both traditional subjects and modern industrial skills. The story of how a young geologist transformed a cattle town into an oil capital became legend, but not in the way of typical frontier tales. There were no shootouts, no dramatic duels at high noon. Instead, it was a victory of progress over tradition, of cooperation over conflict, of knowledge over force. As Jake stood with Sarah on their front porch years later, watching the sunset paint the derricks in gold, he realized that true revolution doesn't always require revolution. Sometimes it just needs vision, patience, and the courage to challenge the established order. The transformation of Fort Worth continued through the seasons, but Jake never forgot the lessons learned during those early struggles. The derricks that now dotted the landscape served as monuments to progress, yet beneath their industrial silhouettes the plains still whispered stories of the old cattle drives. He had managed to bridge two worlds, preserving the best of both while creating something entirely new. Sarah's medical practice expanded to serve not just the oil workers but also the growing families that put down roots in the region. She established a proper hospital, staffed with doctors she'd recruited from back east, ensuring that the community's health needs were met as the population swelled. The sight of her riding out to distant derricks to tend to injured workers became as common as the old image of the country doctor making house calls. William, who had initially opposed Jake's ventures so vigorously, found himself transformed by the changes. His cattle operation adapted, diversifying into transportation services for the oil industry. His wagons, once used for moving cattle, now hauled equipment and supplies to the scattered oil sites. The old rancher discovered that evolution, rather than resistance, was the key to survival in the changing West. The indigenous communities that had first shown Jake the oil seeps became partners in the enterprise, their knowledge of the land proving invaluable as exploration expanded. Through Catherine's legal work, they secured fair contracts and rightful compensation, establishing a new model of cooperation that challenged the old patterns of exploitation. Thomas, the banker who had once been so skeptical, opened new branches throughout the region, his financial acumen helping to stabilize the boom and bust cycle that plagued so many resource towns. He worked closely with Jake to ensure that the wealth generated by the oil fields circulated through the local economy, building a foundation for sustainable growth. Elizabeth's Academy became a beacon of learning, attracting students from as far as Silver City and Abilene. The curriculum she developed bridged the practical needs of an oil economy with the cultural refinements she'd brought from the East. Her graduates went on to become engineers, business people, and civic leaders, shaping the future of the region. Foreign investors still circled, but they found a community united in its determination to control its own destiny. The cattle barons who had once ruled through force discovered that their power diminished not through confrontation, but through the quiet strength of progress. Some, like James, adapted and thrived, while others faded into history, their grand houses standing as memories of a passing era. Emma, who had witnessed the transformation from her small newspaper office, documented it all. Her articles, once focused on cattle prices and local disputes, now chronicled the birth of an industrial empire. Yet she never lost sight of the human stories at the heart of the change, preserving the personal narratives that gave meaning to the larger history. As Jake walked the streets of Fort Worth with his young son, teaching him about both geology and responsibility, he reflected on how the landscape of power had shifted. The corrupt officials who had once threatened his vision were gone, replaced by a new generation of civic leaders who understood that prosperity must be shared to be sustainable. The derricks cast long shadows across the grasslands where cattle still grazed, a visual reminder that progress didn't have to erase the past. The cowboys who had once viewed the oil workers with suspicion now shared tables at local establishments, their children attending the same schools, their futures intertwined in ways their fathers could never have imagined. Sarah and Jake's home became a gathering place where old ranchers and new industrialists found common ground, where deals were struck with handshakes, and where the future of Fort Worth was shaped through conversation rather than confrontation. The library Jake had built, filled with both scientific texts and Western literature, symbolized the fusion of knowledge and tradition that defined their success. Years later, when asked about the secret of his achievement, Jake would simply smile and point to the community around him. The real victory, he explained, wasn't in finding the oil or defeating the opposition. It was in proving that progress could come through partnership, that wealth could serve wisdom, and that the frontier spirit could find new expression in each generation's dreams.